working here? So yeah, that clip from Monty Python and the Holy Grail kind of encapsulates, I think, a lot of what our modern notions of monasticism is like, right? It's just a bunch of guys walking around in robes, flagellating themselves for being too sinful, and constantly contributing nothing to society. And that's unfortunately that's the view of it. And I think that, as Protestants, because we're doing this from a Protestant viewpoint, we have a negative view of monasticism. And I think by and large, it's okay to have a negative view of it, because I don't think by and large it was a good thing. But in any case, we're going to take a look at it because it was a big part of the Middle Ages. And so you have my title there, From Anthony to Friar Tuck. Well, monasticism goes a little bit further beyond Friar Tuck, but of all the monks that we all know, we probably all know Friar Tuck at least the most. So where does it begin? What is this idea of monasticism? The idea of monasticism is essentially living an ascetic lifestyle. So that is a lifestyle devoid of worldly goods, of worldly pleasures, separating yourself from the world, away from all sorts of luxuries and corruption, and living a pious life in the hopes that by living a pious life, you will do works that please God and that will aid in your salvation. Now, when we look at monasticism, we tend to say, well, where did this come from? But it does have a root in the Bible, kind of. If we look at, for example, the prophet Elijah or John the Baptist, these are sort of prototypical monks. These are guys who lived alone in the desert. John the Baptist, very famously wearing his hair shirt, which is notoriously uncomfortable, and the hair shirt would become a symbol of penance. If you were to wear a hair shirt in the Middle Ages, that was a signal to everyone you were doing penance. You were sorry for something, you were atoning for sin. So they take all this stuff from kind of Elijah and John the Baptist. You have an Old Testament and a New Testament basis for this sort of ascetic lifestyle, not having anything, of constantly being hungry and relying on the goodness of others, that sort of thing. And the idea of monasticism was that you would dedicate yourself to the spreading of the word of God. What it rapidly turned into was something a little bit different. I think that the gospel spreading part of monasticism kind of got lost along the way as people instead tried to look for the ascetic piety, the working out their salvation. Rather, they lost a lot of monasteries lost the gospel drive, and they focused on the institutional thing, keeping the monastery going, keeping the power going, keeping all that stuff going. Initially, it's about living an ascetic lifestyle to please God. Now, the first monk of the Christian era is a guy named Anthony. We talked about him very little bit when we were talking about Augustine. Anthony was Augustine's sort of hero. The Life of St. Anthony was the book that brought Augustine into Christianity to understand his sinfulness and his worldliness. And Anthony was a guy who essentially was a Christian from Alexandria, and he decided to live as a hermit in the deserts of Egypt, and his life became sort of a basis for the whole idea of monasticism. So the early years of monasticism, the heartland of this is in Egypt and in North Africa. If you'll remember back to when we were talking about the early church, North Africa, Egypt, Tunisia, that whole area is a hotbed of Christian thinking. Augustine lived there. Alexander was there, Athanasius was there, and that all kind of ended when the Muslims very quickly took it over in the 7th century. But it was a hotbed of Christian thought and Christian actions, and in fact, the world's oldest monastery still exists in this area, and that is St. Catherine's Monastery. This is the oldest monastic community still existing, and it's at the foot of Mount Sinai. And it was founded by the Emperor Justinian in 565. It is a part of the Greek Orthodox Church, and it also has the oldest continuously operating library in the world. This library preserves some of the oldest manuscripts of ancient texts, and also ancient theological texts are here. So this is kind of a holdover from a long time ago. The community is not big. There's not a lot of monks there anymore, but this is still going on. Yeah, it's quite something, eh? And this would kind of give you kind of a prototypical idea of what a monastic community might look like at the time of Justinian. Kind of fortified there, but you have your church in the walls, you have your cloister, you have your houses, and then on the outside you'd have sort of a garden that the monks would work. But yeah, that's where it is. So if you're ever in the Sinai, go take a look. So early Western monasticism, as it applies to us, or as it applies to the Western Church, was started by a guy named Benedict, and he founded a very famous abbey called the Abbey of Monte Cassino. If you're a World War II fan, you may have heard this name before. Monte Cassino was an abbey. It looks like that. That is a reconstruction because the original abbey was bombed to dust by the American 8th Air Force in the Second World War because they thought the Germans were using it as an artillery spotting position. So they bombed it. They bombed it to its foundations. It was rebuilt, and this is the way it would have looked in the 13th century. So, but the Benedict essentially established a rule for monks that that was the rule basically that was followed throughout the Middle Ages with a few tweaks depending on what order of monk you were part of. So basically, the rule boils down to pax ora e labora, which is peace, pray, and work. This is your life. You'll live at peace, you will pray, and you will work. If you're not praying, you are working. If you're not working, you're praying. Monastic communities at this time were tended to be quite small and isolated, and the monasteries at this time are also quite poor. So later on in the Middle Ages, they're going to get quite wealthy. A lot of them will get wealthy. Not all of them will be wealthy, but a lot of them will get quite wealthy, and they'll acquire lots of land. But in this era, they're quite small and they're quite poor. A monk's cell would probably look like a mud hut to us. If you were to see a monk's cell from the Dark Ages, it would be small mud hut, thatched roof, straw on the floor for a bed. That's about it. That's all you would have. And of course, no personal possessions. Medieval monastic life is regulated by prayer. You are praying at least 8 times a day. It is the most important activity, and you're 7 or 8 times a day you are praying. And apart from prayer, monks will focus on certain tasks. Some monks will focus on farming, others will focus on reading, others will focus on writing and studying, or making products to sell to other monastic communities or to the larger community around them. And one of the things that they made were were icons. If you remember, particularly in the Eastern Church, icon making was a big economic activity for a lot of monasteries. They made a lot of money from making icons, but they made all sorts of things. Everything from fabrics and wool to cheeses, agricultural products, spices, everything you can think of were all made by these monks as a way of supporting their living and earning money for the monastery. So generally, when you're admitted to the monastery, you come in on a probationary basis. So you don't take your full vows or your full orders initially. You come in on a probationary basis. They want to know if you are attuned or accustomed or good fit, rather, for this life, because it's a difficult life. And during the probationary period, the monastery, much like a job's probationary period today, they have the right to fire you within the first 90 days without any notice, or 60 days, or whatever it is. And the same thing in the Middle Ages. They could tell a guy to go home, you're not working out here, or the guy could just pick up and leave, and no one's the worse for wear. However, once you take your full vows, in the medieval church, and particularly the early medieval church, it was a vow that was considered unbreakable. You cannot break this oath ever. Even the Pope cannot absolve you of this vow. This is a very serious thing, to dedicate yourself to the monastery. And the monks, they wear their garb is these habits, these what you would see, these kind of very coarse linen garments. They may or may not have undergarments, depending on where you are. And that's basically it. They may have a leather belt that straps around their waist to kind of hold the whole thing together, but that's about it. And if you're a very good monk and you're very penitent and you're very pious, you would wear a hair shirt, which would constantly itch and irritate you as a reminder of your sinfulness, that you always needed to pray. And of course, the best example of this is Martin Luther. We'll talk about his experience in the Augustinian monastery when he just couldn't do enough penance. I don't think there's anybody who's ever been like that. Ireland. So Ireland became sort of an early outpost of monastic life, kind of early on. You'll remember that I talked about earlier that Ireland was converted to Christianity before England was, which is a little bit odd considering that it's way out on nowadays it's still quite remote from the rest of Europe, but back then it was way on the edge of the world, basically. But they were converted first, and they had a very different view of the job of the monk or the job of the monastery as opposed to the continental view. So in Ireland, the church tended to be egalitarian. They tended not to put too much stock on the differences in the authority of bishops versus priests. They tended to see kind of churchmen as equal. They didn't really put much stock in the idea of accumulating worldly power or worldly wealth. They were actually very interested in the idea of spreading the gospel, which is why when you go into early English history, you will find that the revered saints, the early missionaries to England, are either from Rome or they are from Ireland. So, and one of the most, probably the most famous of these early monks is a guy named St. Cuthbert. So if you go to England today, particularly in the north of England, you will find kind of relics of his name in places. And the place most associated with Cuthbert is the island of Lindisfarne, which you may have heard of. Lindisfarne was a site of learning and art. They're very famous for the Lindisfarne Gospels, which are probably the best example of illuminated medieval text that we have. They're called the Lindisfarne Gospels. But Cuthbert was famous for establishing that monastery. And in fact, when the monastery was sacked by the Vikings, the monks decided, well, we're tired of being attacked all the time. So they decided to pick up and move to the mainland. And the most precious thing they took along with them was the body of St. Cuthbert, who had been dead several hundred years. So he's a fairly significant figure at this time. But the Irish monks kind of combine the characteristics of hermits and monks. These monks would sometimes leave the monastery to live as hermits out in the countryside somewhere, whereas in Europe that wasn't quite the thing. Monks didn't really leave the monastery once they were in it, whereas the Irish tended to have a more focus more on personal piety, and I guess if you want to call it a personal relationship with God. But that personal piety was very important to them. The communal thing was important, but also the personal thing. So you would leave, you would be a hermit for a while, you'd come back to the monastery, and you combine the two. And when you left, you would often take on the role of a missionary. And so you might go to different communities and you might preach the gospel or serve as a priest or perform sacraments as time went on. The Irish monks were noted for their scholarship, their wide knowledge of theology, their wide knowledge of biblical languages and natural sciences. This is not a reputation Ireland has now, unfortunately. They do not have a reputation for this. It's unfortunate because the Irish monks were known for being sort of the great theologians of their time. They were very, very well respected. So what is the monastery structured like? Well, it's led by an abbot. If you remember what was the movie? The guy yells, "Hey, abbot." You remember? Is the Robin Hood Men in Tights? I can't remember. Anyway, it's that joke. I should have put a video on here. But in any case, so they're led by the abbot. And so depending on the circumstances of the area where the monastery is located, the abbot may act as a bishop or a priest outside the monastery. The abbot doesn't do this by default. This would be an extra duty that he would perform if the monastery was located perhaps in an area that was remote or that didn't have access to regular visits by a bishop or a priest. The abbot or the monks might take on additional responsibilities in the community, but that wasn't the default necessarily. He was assisted by several officials in his household. In very wealthy monasteries, he would act as a sort of local feudal lord. So as time goes on, monasteries do become a little bit wealthier and abbots do kind of take on this additional secular role. Monks are not necessarily ordained as priests, and that may be interesting to you because we would think of monks might be priests, but they're not necessarily ordained as priests because they haven't gone through seminary or they haven't gone through the priestly training of the church. They've been tonsured in the monastery. They've been trained up in the monastery. They've been given a job in the monastery, but they haven't necessarily been given the authority to perform sacraments, which is what the big thing about being a priest, is that you can perform sacraments. And a monk cannot, unless he's ordained, he cannot perform sacraments. There is some debate as to whether monks should become priests, because some monastic leaders saw becoming a priest as a corrupting influence, which is interesting. So you're in an area that has no priest, let's say, and so you have some monks come along and say, well, we need priests here. Well, you might have some leaders of the monastery or some older monks in the monastery will say, no, you can't make these guys priests, because if you make them a priest, it will corrupt them. What does that tell you about the reputation of priests in the medieval church? Priests already had this reputation of being corruptible. It's not good. Priests are known, some priests, the more corrupt priests, are known for selling sacraments or accepting fees for the performance of the sacraments, which is a no-no. That is banned later on at a church council. That's a bad thing. People shouldn't have to pay you for communion. They shouldn't have to pay you for baptism or the last rites or any of these things. These are all things that are about the link between man and God. And if you have to pay for them, that is like making God a worker, or God giving services or selling salvation. It doesn't work. And so that corrupting influence is something that they're trying to keep out of monasteries in some cases, in any case. Monks typically are not poor. They do not come from poor backgrounds. If you're poor, you typically cannot enter a monastery. One, because your family needs you to work to support the family. Number two, because you have nothing to give the monastery. When you entered the monastery, you turned over all your worldly goods, and you would often pay a fee to support your upkeep while you're at the monastery, so that the monks weren't out resources taking care of you. And if you're poor, you can't do this. And so that's a problem. So generally, these are middle to upper class men. And they're also convents, of course, with women. I think I neglected that actually in this lecture, but women have the same kind of thing, although nunneries do not have the same kind of social, they don't have the same social stature that a monastery would have. They're a little bit lower down. That's, again, unfortunately typical of the status of females in the Middle Ages. But in any case, because they were middle and upper class men, these guys tended to be more educated when they came into the monastery. They tended to be able to read and write, which contributed to the academic prowess of a lot of these places. Monasteries at the beginning were very poor, but as time goes on, they become places of great religious significance. People will pilgrimage to these places. Sometimes a monastery will hold relics. As time goes by, certain abbots, certain monks gain the status of saints. And so because they have saints and they're probably buried in this monastery, their relics now become an important thing for pilgrimage. And so because making a pilgrimage to venerate a relic gets you time off in purgatory and time off of doing penance for your sins. And so monasteries, basically through the tourist trade, begin to accumulate a lot of wealth. Wealthy people will also endow monasteries with land and money when they die. They will do this again to gain favor with God, because if they're, if you're a really pious person, you're going to give, a huge chunk of your land or your money to the monastery. That's going to stand you in good stead with the big guy upstairs. He's going to like that. So a lot of people will do that, but they will also give monasteries gifts in exchange for the saying of masses. So if you had a relative who had died, for example, or you were ill, or a relative was ill, or there was, some sort of crisis going on in the area, you might pray for a mass to be said in your name or in your relative's name or whatever, for the purposes of kind of gaining the favor of God. And so the monks would say it specifically for you. They would perform the mass specifically for you, not as a sort of a general thing, but specifically for you. And so you would endow them with money to kind of add to this kind of pious gesture that you are making. So as time goes on, you can imagine that a lot of these monasteries, particularly the most popular or the most well-known monasteries, will become very wealthy. This makes monastic life, which had previously seemed ridiculous, seem really cushy. If you're in the Middle Ages and you are living in a town that's really dirty and dusty, does not have any sanitation, your prospects for economic enrichment or political movement or whatever are tamped down, particularly if you are a nobleman. If you're a nobleman and you have an older brother, he's going to inherit everything, and so you have nothing, and so you've got to find a way to make your way in the world. And being in the monastery was kind of attractive after a while, because they were wealthy and they were comfortable. They had kind of, yeah, they're ascetic. They still wear the gowns, but somehow the robes are a little bit less rough, and the food is a little bit better, and the beds are a little bit more comfortable. And instead of having to, if you're good at gardening, you can work in the garden. But actually, some of these monasteries get so big that they actually acquire serfs. So serfs are peasants. They're kind of like slaves, but they're peasants tied to the land. They're peasants who can't leave the land. They have to stay on that land. They can't leave without permission of the local lord. And so monasteries begin to even own serfs. And so if you have a monastery that owns serfs, and the serfs are working the land for you, and they're doing all that kind of stuff, well, you can devote all your time to reading, perhaps, or copying manuscripts, or studying, or that sort of thing. And so you can become very, very well educated and live a relatively good and cushy life here. So what happens is the monastic life, which started off as kind of this idea of, we see the corruption that's inherent in some people in the church, and some of the high church officials, all the carousing and the wealth. We're going to get away from that. We're going to separate ourselves from that, and we're going to live a life of ascetic piety where we devote ourselves to the contemplation of God. But what happens as the centuries roll by is that everybody sees the piety of these guys, and they say, oh, we can use our money and our wealth. We can get a chunk of that pie too without actually having to do it. And so the monasteries become wealthy. And so the corruption that the original monks saw in the church early on, and in society in general, starts creeping into the monasteries. And so this is a problem. And there is a movement for reform. So around the High Middle Ages, we have a movement for reform. Around 1000 to 1250, there are people who are saying, look, there's too much wealth, there's too much money, there's too much political power in monastic life. It's corrupting us. It's corrupting what we stand for and what we're supposed to be doing. So monks are supposed to be pursuing a life of simplicity, of asceticism, of poverty, and most importantly, of godliness. They were supposed to be increasing in piety. They were not supposed to be, you're not supposed to get into the monastery and all of a sudden find your morals in the dumps. You're supposed to get into the monastery and have your piety increase, become a more moral person, more godly person. But that wasn't happening. And so the reformers felt that the monastic tradition, or that the tradition that had developed was not carrying out the mission that Benedict and other early monks had set out for it. So monks were not preaching the gospel. They were not acting as missionaries anymore. They were less and less concerned about the needs of the community, and in particular the poor. And what you see is when society becomes corrupt, when society becomes really corrupt, the first people who suffer are the poor. That's not a statement of communism. That's not a socialist statement. That's a statement of observation. When you see a society where the poor are neglected to such an extent that you see levels of abject poverty, not people who have to kind of scrape every penny together, kind of get by, but they can still get by. We're talking about abject poverty. People just have nothing. There is nothing, and there's no way for them to get brought up. That is a sign of a corrupted society, and we see that now. That's a common thing now. Even in our wealthy country of Canada, we see that quite a bit, and that's been the case in places like Africa and in Asia for a while. But I definitely think that that's the case here. It kind of speaks to the corruption of Western society, how we've moved away from the Christian values that sustained us for hundreds of years, and kind of adopting secular values of me first and everybody else last. In fact, if you've noticed on Steinbeck Online today, they published an article that Steinbeck is once again the most generous city in the country. Why does Steinbeck constantly win that award? I think it's because, number one, there's a very strong Christian culture here. I think that's part of it. But I think there's also a very weak generosity of spirit and culture and a weak religious culture in the rest of the country. And we're seeing that. Areas of the country where there's a strong, solid Christian base, a practicing solid Christian base, charitable donations are higher. In places where it's just nominal or not at all, they're very, very low. So an atheist can say to you, I am a moral atheist. But then you look at the society of moral atheism, and what do you see? Abject poverty. There's nobody there to help anybody, because all these atheists are like the Pharisee who says, well, they see the poor man on the street and they say, well, I wish you every good luck, and walk on their way. And they think that they've done something good. No, that's not how it works. So the corruption that was coming into the monastic life needed reform. And reform came about in the form of a guy named Dominic of Guzman, and he founded an order called the Dominicans. Now, the Dominican order is founded in Toulouse, which is in southern France, by the Spanish priest Dominic of Guzman in 1216. So this is right close to the end of the High Middle Ages. Dominic had been traveling with the Bishop of Osma on a diplomatic mission to Denmark on behalf of the King of Spain. None of that is important, it's just interesting information. The goal was to arrange a marriage between their children. Why a Dane would want to marry a Spaniard, I don't know. That's interesting. I don't even know why they would want that alliance. It doesn't even make sense, but whatever. The party traveled through southern France, as you have to do at this point, because sea travel is very, very dangerous. And Dominic encountered a group of people called the Cathars. And he decided that something needs to be done, because the Cathars are a sect of radical heretics. They existed between the 12th and 14th century, and they had a dualistic view of God. So basically they said there were two opposing deities, good and bad. So this is not God and Satan, there's a good deity and a bad deity. So God might be the good deity might be personified in God, and the bad deity is personified in Satan. But this is not a hierarchical thing where we all assume that God is greater than Satan. There are two kind of balancing forces here. So the material world, said the Cathars, is bad and tainted by sin. The spiritual world is good and pure. Where else do we see this? In Plato. The spiritual is good. Plato says the material world is corrupt. The spiritual is good, the material world is corrupt. This is Greek philosophy, just kind of regurgitated for the Middle Ages. They held that Christ had not been incarnated physically, and they adopted a non-Trinitarian view called modalism, which is, of course, a heresy that we talked about earlier on. You could characterize them as sort of a neo-Gnostic sect. So if you think about Gnosticism in the Old or the New Testament, this is kind of a regurgitated form of that with different bells and whistles on it. So there's two levels of believers in the Catharis. There are the perfect, or the perfecti, or the bonhommes, as they call them, which are the baptized members, and the credentes, which are the non-baptized members. The perfecti eat a vegetarian diet, no meat. They do allow fish. I've never quite understood how fish is not a meat, but whatever. I guess if you're on a vegetarian diet, you need some protein in you. You need to make some adjustments. And fish is not a meat. Okay, whatever. But also they rejected oath taking, and we as Mennonites, we know what that's like. We reject the oath as well, or at least our ancestors did. And this, of course, put them at odds with the local civil government, because taking the oath is very important, because you're swearing oaths of loyalty to the local lord, you're swearing oaths of telling the truth in court, you're doing all sorts of oath taking in the Old Testament, and by refusing to take these oaths, you are putting yourself at odds with the civil government. They had an idea of reincarnation, which formed a part of their beliefs. Women were allowed to be leaders, and they had a very large role in the Cathari movement. But they were eventually decimated by a concerted effort of the Catholic Church in a thing called the Albigensian Crusade. And the church also threw the Inquisition at them. And in fact, the Cathars will be one of the prime impetuses for having the Inquisition, started with the Cathars. But in any case, Dominic encounters the Cathars, and he sees that these guys are heretics, and we need to preach the gospel to them. They need the gospel here. That's what they need. They don't need to be ground into dirt by an army. They don't need to be whipped or burned at the stake by the Inquisition. They need the gospel. We need to bring them back into communion with the church. Catharism was very popular in southern France, in Toulouse, and Dominic was interested in understanding why. He saw that in Toulouse and in southern France, the church and the political elites of the area presented themselves in a very ostentatious and a very pompous manner. They were dressed very nicely in very expensive silks and other materials of their robes, cloth of gold, cloth of silver, jewels, all that sort of thing. They would move around in procession, preceded by officials and soldiers and all that kind of stuff. These grand processions. The Cathari, those are church leaders, yeah. So the church leaders did that, and the local lords. So if you think about sort of the state opening of Parliament in the UK, or any royal occasion in the UK, that was kind of how these churchmen were moving around all the time. And the Cathari, on the other hand, moved around in a very ascetic and humble way. They didn't have all the ostentation. In fact, when they moved around, they looked incredibly humble. They were wearing hair shirts. They weren't all dolled up. They weren't necessarily bathed. They looked like they were everyday people. They were the common man. But they offered more than, if you saw a monk doing that, that's a monk. But if you saw the Cathari, he looks like he's got something else. Like he's happy in his poverty, that there's a contentment there. And so this is kind of why people in the area were attracted to that movement, because it contrasted with the pomposity of the church. So people were essentially attracted to their lifestyle, which seemed more authentic to them. And authenticity is a big thing. If you see, for example, we're all aware of the Meghan Markle and Prince Harry interview, no doubt by now. I don't know if you've watched it. I haven't, and I don't intend to. Good with the quotes that have been presented, but they do not present themselves as a down-to-earth and humble couple. Or actually, they try to. Down-to-earth and humble, as opposed to the queen in her palaces. But the difference is that they're sitting on a terrace in LA, in a mansion, being interviewed by a billionaire. They have many millions of dollars, and they are saying how tough their life has been. We've experienced problems in the royal household. They didn't support us. Well, to the person in Britain or the UK who has lost their job due to COVID and is having a tough time raising their family because their kids are stuck at home and not in school and they aren't learning anything, or the person who is paid thousands of dollars to attend university or colleges and is not getting the education they want, or the person who has fallen ill because of this, or they've had a surgery canceled because of this whole thing. It's really petty. It's really petty to see these wealthy millionaires who dress themselves down to, we're just like you. We have all the same problems as you. Yeah, except that you have tens of millions of dollars with which to deal with it. We have nothing. That's kind of the fake down-to-earth, that's kind of the fake authenticity, or the fake down-to-earth, or the fake authenticity is presented by the church in this time. We're down to earth. We're just like you. Yes, I'm wearing silk and my robe is cloth of gold. And yes, I live in a bishop's palace over there, but I have all the same problems of you. Now here's the stale bread from my table. Go away. It doesn't work. People don't like that. The authenticity, you can see through that like a window. And that's what was happening in the south of France. So Dominic, he sees the problem. He's not French. He's not from the south of France. He's from Spain. And so he sees the problem. And he says, you need to put off your ostentatious airs and the marks of status and adopt a more humble lifestyle and attitude. Pretty simple thing. Now, the church leaders did take him up on this to some extent, and Dominic did have some limited success evangelizing the Cathars, but not tons. The roots of Catharism were far deeper than I think anybody could quite understand at the time, because he had kind of come about around 100 years after it had begun. So it was very, very deeply rooted in southern France, but he tried, and that was the important thing. So by founding the Dominican order, he does not found it as a typical monastic community. A typical monastic community is based in one place. There is a church, there is a cloister, there are monks' houses. All their needs are taken care of through the local community. It's kind of stationary. Dominic says, no, our job is to go out and to preach to the people. That's our main job, is to preach the gospel. And so he founds the Dominicans as a mendicant order. So when you hear this word mendicant, that's an order that moves around. These monks are constantly moving. We tend to call these guys friars. They're not typically called monks, but they're called friars. But nonetheless, it is an order of, or it is a monastic order. Nowadays, the Dominican order is also known as the Order of Preachers. So if you see a Catholic churchman on TV and he's got OP after his name, he's a Dominican. That's how you know he's a Dominican. The Dominicans were known for their scholarship and their scriptural knowledge and their preaching ability. These guys were sharp. They were, think about, your favorite apologists, unfortunately not Rabbi Zacharias anymore, but think of your favorite apologist or your favorite preacher, the guys who have all the correct information, but they can get right down and they can talk to people, and people understand these complicated theological concepts. That's what these guys are like. They're sharp. They're on the ball. They're zealous for what they are doing. Completely different with the typical monastic orders of the day. They play a very large part in the Americas. In Canada, we have Dominicans, I believe, and also Jesuits are sort of the first orders to come in here as missionaries into this country, and also into the Spanish Empire. When Spain starts conquering in South America, the Dominicans are among the first missionaries into that area. And in English, they have been given the name of Black Friar because of their black habit. They wore a black robe, and so they're called Black Friars. And so if you go to England and you see a place that's called Blackfriars, there's probably a Dominican lodge or a Dominican house there, or something to do with the Dominican order was probably there. That's, it's called Blackfriars. The other order that was founded around this time were the Franciscans. Now, the Franciscans nowadays, of course, we know them because the Pope is a Franciscan. He's the first Franciscan to be Pope. And it was founded by Francis of Assisi in 1209. And they are also known as the Orders of the Friars Minor. So if you see OFM after a name of a Catholic churchman, that is a Franciscan. Francis was inspired to a life of poverty and preaching after hearing a sermon on Matthew 10:9, which I didn't actually, I was going to put it in here, but I didn't. But in any case, the Sermon on the Mount, I think. Is that not? No? Okay. Yeah. There you go. So Jesus telling the disciples to go off, don't take anything with them, rely on the kindness of others, that sort of thing. And the Franciscans, Francis took that literally. He came from a very wealthy family. He gave away all of his wealth, all of it. He didn't keep any of it. He gave it all away. And anybody in his order was forbidden from having personal property. They were so poor that they had to beg for food. That was part of this being in this order. You had to beg, literally relying on the goodness and the kindness of others, and then taking nothing with you, no money, nothing. And they grew exponentially. This was huge because these guys, again, the authenticity of what they are doing, the basis of what they're doing so clearly spelled out in the gospel. Jesus said this, so we're doing that. It appealed to a lot of people who were not, who did not like the ostentation of the church at the time. And again, the Franciscans are a major missionary order, like the Dominicans, and they end up being in the Americas as well. And we know this, of course, because the Pope is from Argentina and he's a Franciscan, and his lineage in this goes all the way back to Francis of Assisi and all that kind of stuff. So, anyway, so we're going to talk about just a few of the orders now. So these are just kind of the main orders. There are many monastic orders nowadays. We're just going to talk about a few of the main ones. So the Augustinians, these are the guys associated with Martin Luther. Very strict lifestyle, tended to wear black robe with leather belt, flagellation, all that sort of stuff. That was all associated with the Augustinians. Very big on the, I believe, on the notion of silence. Was a very important concept to them, keeping silent as much as possible. They were founded in the 1200s, again, as a mendicant order, much like the Dominicans and the Franciscans, but they later became more established and they had monasteries and property as well. The Benedictines, they're probably the largest group, I would think. They're kind of like the mother group of all of this, founded by St. Benedict at Monte Cassino in 529. They were focused on manual labor, prayer, peace, and simplicity. Then the Cluniacs came around in around 910. And they were basically a response to the idea that the monks around, or the monasteries around at the time, were too much influenced by the rulers of the day. We needed to reform the system, so they decided this is going to be a reformed Benedictine system. They kind of back to the basics, a Reformation before the Reformation, and they dedicated themselves to sort of helping the poor and the sick, and they were noted. For helping refugees from the Vikings. They held art in very high esteem. They were well known for their art, and I believe also for their healing. They were noted for their medicine, or their knowledges of medicine. The Cistercians, again, an offshoot of the Benedictines, founded at Citeaux. They wanted to return to a more simple monastic life like that of St. Benedict. Again, this is a reform movement. They rejected the idea that art can be worshipped, so they are opposed to the Cluniacs. You Cluniacs think that your art, by doing your art, you're worshiping God. That's nonsense. Art is not worship. You have to focus on manual labor and study. That is true worship. And so they were very much a service-oriented group, and they were also they're also the order that Saint Bernard of Clairvaux was part of. I don't expect you to know who Bernard of Clairvaux was. We will cover him when we talk about the first, or when we talk about the Crusades, because he was kind of instrumental in that. But nonetheless, the Cistercians, the Cluniacs, they're all kind of Reformed Benedictines. They all kind of oppose, and they kind of had arguments in amongst each other. Then you have the Carthusians in 1084. These guys really held to the vow of silence. Monks spent most of their time in their cells. They emerged to pray and to participate in services, most of which were silent. Imagine doing church quietly, no talking, no noise. And they developed, if you're a fan of liqueurs, they developed chartreuse. So if you like chartreuse, the Carthusians are the ones you have to thank for that. And I included the Trappists here because it's a Manitoba connection. They are not part of the Middle Ages. They were founded in 1664. They are a Reformed Cistercian order. And of course, they still have their monastery today, I believe just north of Winnipeg, where they make cheeses. Very famous cheeses. But of course, they were also the Our Lady of the Prairies in St. Norbert that burned down Abbey. That's the Trappist monastery. So I thought I'd include it in there because we all have a connection to that. And of course, the Grey Nuns as well. I did not include them. I'm sorry to all the women out there. So I just want to talk very quickly about the military orders, because this is going to become important when we talk about the Crusades. So you had the original idea of monks was that they were nonviolent and that they had a life of contemplation and prayer and asceticism. And later on, the idea came up that they could also be knights. And this was basically a response to the reports that were coming out of the Middle East by pilgrims that pilgrims were being attacked by Muslims on their way to Jerusalem, because it was common at the time you would take a pilgrimage from Europe to Jerusalem. That was a big thing, and you would have to go through Islamic lands. And so one of the big things that was running through Europe was the violence of the various Muslim lords and bandits who lived in these areas. And so this idea came up that these pilgrims need protection. And so these military orders came up. And of course, the most famous of these are the Knights Templar, who we've all probably heard of, the Knights Hospitaller, who you may have heard of, and the Teutonic Knights, who you may have seen in video games. And these orders were generally founded around the First and Second Crusades, again, to protect pilgrims. So the Knights Templar, very quickly, founded in 1119. They were based at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, in what is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or Asqa, A-S-Q-A, Al-Aqsa Mosque. When Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders in the First Crusade, they took it, the Al-Aqsa Mosque served as the royal palace for a short time, and then the Crusaders used it as a stable. These knights took the same sort of monastic vows that other monks would take in terms of poverty and chastity and prayer and all that sort of thing. But they also combined this with military and martial training. The Knights Templar were originally a Cistercian order, and they were extremely elite warriors. These are knights kind of on the level above European knights, because these guys had two jobs. One was to pray and the other is to fight. So they had a lot of time to dedicate to military training. As time goes on, the knights become very, very powerful because large donations of land and money are made to the order, and they have significant holdings in the Middle East and in Europe, and they even act as a bank, interestingly enough. This is one of the first proto-international bank. If you were going on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, you could go to your local branch of the Templar order and deposit with them an amount of money that you wanted to have available to you in the Holy Land. And so you would deposit it with them, and they would give you a certificate of deposit, properly sealed and notarized, if you were, let's say, in Paris. And then you would make your way to Jerusalem. And when you got to Jerusalem, you would present your certificate to the Templars in Jerusalem, and they would pay out to you the money you deposited in Paris. So this was an international banking system. And of course, like all banks, you get to charge a fee for doing what you do. And this added to their great wealth, and money kind of came pouring in. So this is sort of banking before there were the concept of banks, and it was very, very successful. The revenues of the Templars, now the Templars, we can look at that and say, well, these guys are really greedy, but it takes a lot of money to maintain a private army. And these guys needed all of it for their charity work and for their military work. The Templars not only focused in the Middle East, but eventually they would be part of the Reconquista in Spain and Portugal, which was the campaign to force the Muslims off of the Iberian Peninsula. They fought in the northeast of Europe along the Baltic coast, suppressing pagan people there. The banking operations were so stable and secure that kings began to depend on them for loans and treasury services. So this bank was so big that they were bankrolling France. They were bankrolling England. That's how powerful and wealthy these guys were. Now, recruits came from all over Europe, but they had some conditions. They had to be freemen. They could not be illegitimate. So if you were not born, if your parents were not married when you were born, you could not be a Templar. They could not be indebted, and they had to make a substantial donation to the order. So most of the Templars will be second sons of wealthy nobles or merchants, which only adds to the military nature, or to the high martial standard that they maintained. The order was headed by a guy called the Grand Master. The order ran into trouble, however, because as the order grew, monarchs became to be very wary of them. They did not like this. A private army, which is like, so this is like a private bank with a private army all over Europe. And not only that, but we're indebted to these guys. We borrow a lot of money from these guys. And so things start to become a little bit hairy for them in a lot of areas. They control castles, fortresses, lands, all sorts of things. And so they were eventually accused of corruption and abuse of power. Now, whether or not this is true is still kind of up for debate. But basically what happened was in 1307, King Philip IV of France, who owed them a lot of money, decided that he was going to wipe them out. So he arrested all the Templars in France, and he accused them of heresy, denying Christ, participating in homosexual orgies, kissing and worshiping idols, and perverting holy images. All these accusations were false. These were all false accusations, and pretty demonstrably false as well. The Pope, Clement V, he initially attempted to defend the Templars because the Templars are under his direct authority, so why wouldn't he attempt to defend them? But Philip IV, being the wily and crafty king that he is, tortures the leadership of the Templars, and he extracts false confessions from them. And with these false confessions publicized and made public, the Pope is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. He has to agree. The Pope is also stuck because he needs Philip IV's support for certain things that he's trying to do. So he's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. The Pope decides that he's going to dissolve the order, and the last Grand Master was a guy named Jacques de Molay. He is burned at the stake along with 54 other people in Paris in 1310, and the Pope pensioned off the rest of the knights in Europe, and their property was given to the Knights Hospitaller. Although many kings and noblemen stole this property and this wealth, and they just kind of ran away with it because the whole thing was falling apart. But Templar buildings still exist today. So, for example, these are two examples of Templar buildings. The one on the left, I believe, is a castle church in Portugal, where the Templars kind of reformed themselves into something called the Order of Christ. And then on the right is a church in the French countryside. It's a Templar church in the French countryside. And if you've ever been to London, you may have seen this church on the left. This is the Templar Church in London. It was featured also in the Da Vinci Code. Good book, terrible movie. And then on the right is a Templar castle. But just these buildings, they still exist to this day. The Templars, the next ones were the Knights Hospitaller. They were founded in 1113 as the Knights of the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. We still have these guys. Have you ever heard of St. John's Ambulance or the Knights of Malta or the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. Most of us will know the St. John's Ambulance thing. They're all tied back to the Hospitallers. If you'll notice, our Lieutenant Governor and our Governor General, they all have badges of the Order of St. John. They all wear them. When you become a Lieutenant Governor or a Governor General, you're inducted into the order, and so they wear these. So this is still around with us today. So after the fall of the Holy Land, the Hospitallers moved to Rhodes, and then from Rhodes they moved to Malta. And they were founded, like the Templars, to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land. They acquired land and wealth in the Holy Land and in Europe. Just like the Templars, they became quite wealthy. And they were based at the Hospital of St. John in Jerusalem. And they were well known as supporters of the poor, being doctors and healers. They were known kind of for the kindness and the charity they provided to people, as well as for their military prowess. They controlled most, if not all, of the hospitals in the Holy Land while there were Crusader states there, and they didn't, unlike the Templars, you didn't have to be a particular rank in society to join, but you did have to be basically of good reputation. And they had about 25 castles in the Middle East. So if you consider, it takes a lot of men to garrison 25 castles, and it takes a lot of money to upkeep 25 castles. So that kind of gives you the idea of how powerful these guys became. So after the fall of the Latin kingdoms of the Holy Land, they went to Rhodes, and they held it until 1522, when it was captured by the Ottoman Turks, and they became a very noted naval power. And then they moved to Malta, and they held on to Malta until 1798, when Napoleon kicked them out. Over time, they were criticized as being, oh my goodness, there's a lot of spelling errors in that. They were criticized as being too egalitarian, too rich, and too ruthless to Muslim prisoners. So kind of all over the map there with the criticism. They drew the ire of monarchs because they were essentially a law unto themselves, but they survived longer than any other military medieval order. So whereas the Templars made enemies, the Hospitallers kept it just the temperature down just enough that they weren't destroyed. There's a few Hospitaller buildings that are still around today. The first one is the most famous. On the left-hand side is Crac de Chevalier, which is a castle in Syria, which is still there. And then on the right, you have Margat, which is another castle in Syria. These are big, big castles, very well fortified. These are kind of the state of the art in terms of medieval fortress architecture. And then at the last, we have the Teutonic Knights, who were founded with the Third Crusade. They were founded basically as a Germanic order, and they had a hospital in Acre, which is a city in the Middle East, where they helped people who were injured during the Muslim siege of that city, or the siege of the city, I think by the Muslims. Oh no, by the Crusaders. Sorry. We'll get all into that when we get to the Crusades. The order has a very short history in the Holy Land. It wasn't around as long as the other ones were. So basically, they were founded in the Third Crusade. At the end of the Third Crusade, they got booted out, and they went back to Central and Eastern Europe, and they founded a base in Prussia. And they had holdings all the way from modern Lithuania to the Mediterranean. Most of the people were from the German aristocracy. The order made money the way the other orders had. They collected taxes, land rents, they had castles, they did some banking. The knights themselves were not allowed to own any property, and they were leading a very austere life, as monks do. But they were allowed to carve wood, but they were not allowed to joust or take part in hunting. So you want to joust? No. You want to hunt? No. But you can carve wood. You can carve as much wood as you want. That's a great thing. Come join us, because carve as much wood as you want. We don't care. This is kind of an extent of the Teutonic Order in Europe. These are places where they had property or military or castles. This is around the year 1300. So mostly they're based in Prussia, which is in the upper right corner there, just close to Russia. And they will form a very a very staunch military Germanic base in Prussia, and that will form the basis of the Junker nobility, which will form the basis of Prussian nobility, which will form the basis of the militaristic German society that eventually comes around to World War I. It kind of has its start with these guys. So they basically made a nuisance of themselves, fighting crusades in the Baltic states, fighting pagans and Russian Orthodox Christians, whom they seemed to slaughter with at will. The knights were very oppressive in their overlordship of the local Prussian population. They had a reputation for being vicious against Christians and pagans alike. And in 1410, an alliance between the Polish crown and the Grand Duke of Lithuania, a military alliance, inflicted a massive defeat on the Teutonic Knights at Tannenberg. Tannenberg is a place where lots of armies get defeated. The Russians will be defeated at Tannenberg in World War I. The Teutonic Knights were defeated at Tannenberg in 1410. And this would diminish the order's power significantly. They would never really recover from this defeat. And they were in fact secularized in the 1500s. And they would essentially be, that means that they returned from being an order, a monkish order protected by the church, to being a secular military unit, just like any other military unit. And they would kind of just fizzle out as a minor unit in the Habsburg armies until the 1700s. So this is the most famous Teutonic building that's still around. This is Malbork Castle. This was a favorite castle of Kaiser Wilhelm I. It is the largest brick structure in the world, and it is also the largest castle in Europe. And it's actually quite picturesque, if you ask me. I would go take a look at it on Google. It's actually quite nice. It's very, very much a good example of medieval architecture. So, achievements of monasticism. Martin Luther criticized monasticism as being incompatible with Christian life. I don't know why I wrote that. That's a typo. Anyway, the monasteries basically achieved several things that we should note. So they served as a repository of ancient texts. Many monasteries had extensive libraries where texts were maintained. They copied the Bible and they continued its dissemination, which before the printing press was really important. It was a laborious task to copy the Bible. To get a copy of the Bible took a long time because it had to be copied by hand. So the monks did this continuously, and that's why we have copies of the Bible during this time, and that served as the basis for the mass-produced copies of the Bible later on. They conducted scientific and medical research. The first studies of genes and DNA, or if you want to talk about genes and heritable characteristics in terms of plants and animals, were actually done in monasteries when they tried to interbreed plant species to get a sort of a better crop and a more hardy plant. They formed communities to support the poor and the sick. They helped in the study of theology by translating works of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew into vernacular languages and into each other so that they could be read. And they served as centers of scholarship and education at a time when academic knowledge wasn't widespread. So for all the faults of monasticism, to bridge the gap from the early church to the modern day, it really did do that because it kept the texts that the reformers relied on in play. It kept them around. It kept them around in enough of a quantity that people all over Europe could kind of study the same thing at the same time. If you didn't have monks and monasteries doing that, these books would have either been lost or would have been so spread out to different private libraries, they would have just been lost forever. So they really did serve a great purpose. And in fact, the universities of Oxford and Cambridge and Paris and Bologna, these great universities of the Middle Ages, are all tied back to the monastic movement. So it really was an important part of the Middle Ages and of the upcoming Protestant Reformation. So that was a lot of information. That was double the amount of our slides that we had last time. So thank you for bearing with me. Do you have any questions about this at all, or thoughts about this or anything else that we've talked about? It's funny how that happens, right? Like, yeah, it never ends. No, absolute power corrupts absolutely. The more power you have, the more likely you are to abuse it. The more wealth you have, the more likely you are to abuse it. It's like when you're a young person and you start having your own money and you have no expenses because you live in with mom and dad, and you have a lot of money. Well, then you get to do stupid things with that money. You can buy stupid cars, or go on ridiculous trips where you do nonsense, or you go off on a hedonistic lifestyle, all because you have this freedom. So money does tend to do that, and does that at every level. So the warnings against money and wealth and the collection of gold and all that kind of stuff that you see in the New Testament is really a serious warning against corruption. But we're people, and lots of people. We all have to learn that the hard way, I think, in some cases, particularly when we're dealing with money. But yeah, like the corruption that happened in the monastic orders was very real, and it had major impacts, and it affected people's view of the church and churchmen, and contributed to cynicism, and it kind of was one of the underlying factors in the Reformation, is this idea. See, with the monks, we saw certain orders develop to reform the monastic system, right? So the Benedictines have become corrupt, so we're going to start this new group, and we're going to reform this. We're going to bring it back to the basics, back where it was. But when none of these reform movements are questioning the theology of the church, none of them are questioning the underpinning beliefs of the church. None of that is being questioned. What is being questioned is the actions of people. You are acting corrupt. You're letting the world and filthy lucre and gold and all this kind of stuff corrupt your morals. But what they're not asking is, are the beliefs of the church somehow wrong? And that's going to be the great advancement of the Reformation, is that you're going to have guys, a monk like Luther, or theologians like Calvin or Zwingli, or all these guys are going to come along and say, well, maybe some of these basic assumptions that we're making are wrong. Maybe that's the problem. It's not. Yeah, you can live a pious life all you want, but if you're believing incorrectly, you're not going to. We would expect you to get corrupt because you're not believing the right thing. You're not believing in the truth. So these reform movements that came along to kind of reform monasticism, they do so for a very little bit, but eventually those groups become, in some ways, corrupted themselves. And so when Luther comes around and he starts questioning this, and he says, no, like some of the basic concepts of the church are wrong. That's when we start to get true, meaningful, long-lasting change, because the Reformation started in 1510 or 1516? No, 15. It was just the 100, it was the 200, whatever. It was the 1500s. The Reformation starts then, is still ongoing now. We would still consider the Reformation ongoing now. And I would hope that the Protestant churches haven't considered themselves to be so corrupted as the monastic movement became. But we see that problem now, even now, like in evangelical churches, we know that there's lots of problems with corruption. The whole thing with Rabbi Zacharias coming out. We see lots of pastors and lots of churches who live very lavish lifestyles, even though personally they may seem like they are, they live very moral lives. They live in multi-million-dollar houses. They have many multi-million-dollar houses. And the question is, well, if you're a pastor and you have all this income, couldn't you? You could live on arguably $100,000 worth of that and give the rest away to somebody or donate it somewhere else. And I know it's unfair. Some people say it's unfair to say that of a pastor. They have the right to earn money for their work too, and they do. But pastors are a different breed. It's a different calling. And so if a pastor certainly has the right to earn a legitimate wage for the work that he does. But when you have that excess and all you do is take that excess and invest it in yourself, that's where the problem comes in. And that's where you see people saying, it's like the people in southern France when they see the bishops and the priests walking around in these expensive clothes very ostentatiously. Well, you're not like me. Like, why would I believe you? You say all these things, but you don't live that way. And so pastors are kind of have a higher calling. So corruption is a problem in the modern church. It's a problem in the ancient church. But the difference between then and the Reformation is that the Reformation challenged the theological underpinnings of the church, not just the superficial actions of the people leading the church. They did a deep dive and they dug in to try and find out where the root was rotten and to get that out and to reform it, whereas trying to prune the tree that's above the ground, but it still is sick. That's how I would kind of look at it. So Reformation movements do happen in the church, but they never quite get to the core of it. We're going to look at the proto-reformers in a few sessions. Guys like Jan Hus, who were kind of reformers before the Reformation. who called out all the same problems that Luther did, but they lost their lives for it, whereas Luther did not. So yeah, we'll get to that at some point. But anyway, that's monasticism. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah. It comes out of this. It comes out of reports, and there's some question as to whether the reports were true or not, because Christians never really stopped making pilgrimages to the Holy Land, but there were reports around this time, around the 12th century, the 11th and the 12th century, that pilgrims were being accosted by Muslim infidels, as they would be seen in the Middle Ages. By these guys, and they're being waylaid and prevented from going to Jerusalem, or even killed, or they're having their property stolen. And the concept of protecting the pilgrims was very important, because what happened was there's a group that said, well, these Muslim lords, the local lords, are not protecting these guys, so we have a responsibility to protect them. And I think it's because it's the Holy Land. If you're a European knight, if you're just a normal knight, chances are you have a castle that you're responsible for, you have land that you own, and your life is fairly comfortable. And so for you to kind of pack up and head on over to the Holy Land to protect pilgrims is not appealing, because you have responsibilities at home as a lord and as a landowner and all these sorts of things, and you probably have obligations to a higher lord, and you have lords below you who have obligations to you. It's this feudal structure. And so the Cistercians, who I believe were the Templar, I'm going to go back to the Templars here, because they were an offshoot of, or the Cistercians. So they were an offshoot of the Cistercian order. So they say, we need to go and we need to protect these pilgrims. And so they form, I don't know if there's any one person you can say that was formed. I think it was an idea where a bunch of guys got together and said, we need to form sort of a holy army to protect these people. The Middle Ages, particularly around the Crusades, when the Templars were formed, was a time when piety was kind of hitting a high, or not piety, but zealous piety was hitting a high. And so the idea that we need to go, think of it as young men getting revved up for something. We need to go and we need to protect the Holy Land for God. We need to do this as a pious thing. The pilgrimage to Jerusalem is one of the most sacred acts that anybody can do, apart from taking part in communion and baptism and all the sacraments of the church. They need to be protected. And so I think that zealousness was the thing that really pushed these monks to form this order. Now, the monks, typically, churchmen were prohibited from drawing blood. So, for example, if you had a priest in battle, in Europe would typically carry a mace as a weapon. You wouldn't carry a sword, because a mace is a crushing weapon. So if you crush someone, they're not going to bleed. Whereas if you slice their throat, they're going to bleed. And so the priest would carry a mace to protect himself. Now, these orders said, well, you can't expect us to apply that to Muslims, right? Because, of course, they're not Christians. There's no prohibition. These are infidels. They don't believe in Jesus. They are enemies of the cross. They're enemies of the church. They're enemies of these pilgrims. And so we have a right to kill them if we want to. And so that's kind of where that comes from. That's how you can justify these monks killing with the sword, whereas in European warfare amongst Christian nations, that wouldn't have been allowed. That would have been a serious thing for a priest to go out with a sword, whereas or for a monk to go out with a sword, whereas in the Holy Land it was not. And in the Holy Land, so if you're a monk, you have no connections to the land. You have no need to maintain your family's property. You have no need to maintain their wealth, because you have no wealth. You're a monk. And so you can stay in Europe and do your studying and all that kind of stuff. But if you're a young man from a noble family and you have martial training, military training, and this is an avenue that's open to you to use your military training to protect the church and to advance the gospel, I guess by the sword, I guess you could claim, why not do it? It was an act of piety, of holiness. So I don't know. I don't know I don't know who had the idea first, but I know it's kind of it's based on these rumors of Christians being attacked, combined with an incredibly high level of zealous piety in Europe at the time. Plus, the millenarianism was also a big idea in Europe at the time. So around the Crusades, we had just passed year 1000. So year 1000 is 1,000 years after the birth of Christ. It's 970 years roughly after his death. Christ is coming back soon. It's 1,000 years, right? That 1,000, that gets people. It's a pesky number in the Bible. It would have been so much easier if they had not included 1,000 in the Bible, but there it is. And so people are saying, he's coming back soon. The return of Christ is coming back soon. Let's go capture Jerusalem so that when he comes back, Jerusalem is in holy hands. It's in the hands of the church, not in the hands of infidels. So that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Nativity, the Temple Mount, all these great things are in the hands of the faithful. That was part of the impetus for doing this. So high zeal, a high level of zeal, rumors of Christians being attacked by infidels, this idea that Christ is coming back any minute. All of this combined to make the First Crusade and to make yourself to be a sort of a fighting monk a very popular thing. And these monks, these orders are also, they sort of had this air of brotherhood, right? When you join these orders, it's a brotherhood. You're amongst fellow warriors. There's even in military units today, there's a great sense of camaraderie, and all of that contributes to it. Then you add to the fact that you think you're doing something useful, you're providing for pilgrims, you have all these services that you can give them in terms of banking, and then the increase in the wealth of the Templars as time goes on. It's a very attractive thing. And just this idea that, I can go as a young man, I can join this order, I can join a monastic order, very holy thing. I can be pious, I can be scholarly, but I can also go out and fight for God. That's a big thing. And most of the Templars will have joined when they're in their early 20s. So these are very, very young men who have just come out of, basically from the age of 12 or 13 being trained militarily. So they will be very, very skilled. And so, if you're a very skilled if you're a very skilled fighter, but you have no land and no wealth, this is a great way to get adventure and to fight for God and all that kind of stuff. So, but it is an odd combination. I will grant you that. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. The military orders were not stocked with monks who had been monks. These were young guys who were getting into this order on the ground floor. They didn't go to convents and abbeys across Europe and start recruiting tonsured monks from these places. These were young men who were encouraged into this because this was a pious way for them to exercise their martial skills and not be condemned to hell for it. Because technically, if you were a Christian knight and you fought with another Christian, or you had a hostility, technically the Pope said 2 Christians cannot fight. 2 Christian kings should not fight, because that Christians fighting each other is unbiblical, it's unholy. And so for 2 knights to fight each other in war was seen as kind of a no-no. It wasn't seen as something that was approved of by the church, but knights fighting Muslims, that was okay. These are not fellow Christians. You can fight them. So that's kind of where it comes to. Now I know that's a theoretical thing. There was lots of war in the Middle Ages. There were lots of Christians fighting other Christians. So this idea that the church somehow had this big thing about preventing Christian kings from fighting each other, it really didn't work out all that well. But the concept was there. This idea, there might have been still that feeling of guilt. I'm a Christian knight and I go and I've slaughtered other Christian soldiers. It's like, well, I feel bad for that, but if I go to the Holy Land, I can engage in my art and in my trade without doing that. And so that was, yeah, that was big. I wouldn't consider these guys mass murderers or that they had a homicidal tendency, but they were warriors looking for a war that they could fight without violating their vows. And the Hospitallers and the Templars did not engage in warfare against other Christian nations. The Teutonic Knights did, but yeah, the Templars really didn't. But the Templars died out pretty quickly. So yeah, it's interesting. We will look next week. We'll start looking. Excuse me. We'll start looking at the Crusades. That will be a multi-session thing. There's just far too much information to pass on in one session. So we'll start looking at the Crusades next week. And we'll start with the Peasants' Crusade, and then we'll move on from there. So if there's no other questions, we are 22 minutes past the hour. And if you want to stay and talk, we can, but I'll just stop the recording now. And we'll see you guys all next week.